Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. Donald Trump stepped to the podium before a joint session of Congress and treated viewers to nearly 2 hours of hallucinatory prattle. He declared without irony that this was the golden age of America. The tone was triumphant, self-satisfied, and unmoored from fact. He described a country reborn, filled with prosperity, order, and fearsome respect abroad. He said crime has vanished. He said the border has been sealed. He said enemies have been defeated, and the economy has never been stronger. It was, in short, the story of paradise restored, all apparently accomplished in a single year. The message was simple and designed to burrow deep into the unconsciousness of viewers. Everything is getting better. Anyone who says otherwise is lying, and yet what went unsaid in that performance was fear, far more revealing than the boast that filled it. Because just days before the address, the Supreme Court had handed Trump the most significant legal defeat of his presidency. In a 6-3 ruling, the justices struck down his emergency tariffs, shattering one of the myths that his power was limitless. In clear, unmistakable language, the court told him that a president cannot unilaterally rewrite trade policy. The justices reminded him that the Constitution does not create monarchs. Business owners who had been whipsawed by his erratic trade decisions breathed a sigh of relief. The decision reasserted that there were still boundaries, still laws, but you would never have known it from his address. He didn't mention the ruling at all. He didn't acknowledge the loss. He didn't promise to work with Congress to draft a lawful trade framework. He did what he always does when confronted by reality. He simply shouted louder. He erased the wound by pretending it didn't exist. The phrase golden age wasn't chosen at random. It was an attempt to build a mythology strong enough to bury the facts. Every autocrat understands that words can do what force sometimes cannot. Trump framed his presidency as a time of unprecedented renewal, and in that story the details didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling, this illusion of revival, this patriotic high. He spent years perfecting the skill of drowning complexity in slogans. The problem is that slogans can become the architecture of unfreedom. When leaders teach people that narrative is more important than truth, the people eventually adapt. They learn to live comfortably amid contradiction. Trump's government has used that adaptation to stretch federal authority in dangerous ways. His administration has targeted election offices across the country, justifying the same discredited conspiracy theories he's been repeating since 2020. Those theories are no longer campaign rhetoric. They're now operational doctrine. His Attorney General, Pam Bondi, has turned the Justice Department into a tool of intimidation, using subpoenas and federal agents to comb through ballots, demand records, and unsettle local officials. Secretaries of State from both parties have warned that the real goal isn't oversight but fear. The aim is to make states and election workers flinch before the midterms, to plant a sense of surveillance over a process meant to be independent. And at the same time, Trump has been pressing Congress to give him sweeping new powers over domestic surveillance, since the programs are just extensions of law and order. He always describes the instruments of his control as benign forces of safety. The violent immigration raids are just routine enforcement. The sweeping data collection is simply modernization. The question of who wields these instruments and how their power can be abused never arises. Of course, every president highlights good news and softens the bad. But Trump's speeches belong to a different category altogether. They are exercises in dominance, designed to assert that disagreement itself is illegitimate. The point is not to convey information, but to flood the senses until resistance feels futile. His method is as simple as it is effective. He claims the country is on the verge of an era of greatness. He says only his leadership made it possible. And then he labels any institution that stands in his way, courts, Congress, the press, as corrupt saboteurs of the people's will. That's how a strong man manufactures legitimacy. The grandeur of the promise erases the smallness of the truth. When the judiciary sides with him, he glorifies it as wise, courageous, and patriotic. When it constrains him, it becomes a nest of partisans. After the Supreme Court's tariff ruling, he told trade partners he would find new ways to impose economic pressure. Within days, he cobbled together a patchwork of temporary measures issued under other statutes. In his words, he had found creative solutions. In reality, he was defying the same limits he'd been disciplined for crossing. The pattern is familiar. When one door closes, he breaks down another. The defeats vanish into the mist, replaced by new boasts about how unstoppable he is. The result is not just a cover-up of legal losses. It's a fundamental rejection of the idea that law applies to him at all. That rejection forms the core of Trump's appeal to his base. He does not ask to be trusted because he knows the rules. He demands allegiance because he claims to embody the people's will. His authority emanates from some mystic connection with his followers, not from the Constitution, which means any limit on that authority automatically becomes a betrayal. Every institution that tries to constrain him, the courts, the press, even Congress itself, becomes an obstacle to the national will, which he alone personifies. Once that logic takes hold, the meaning of citizenship changes. It becomes less about principles and more about obedience. The Constitution fades. What remains is the man. History shows how this dynamic spreads. The strong man tells the people that a crisis exists, even if it doesn't. He says the crisis can only be solved by his unique genius. When institutions resist his methods, he calls them illegitimate. The judiciary obstructs justice, the legislature engages in sabotage, dissenters commit treason. Before long, public loyalty drifts away from democratic norms and toward the leader himself. Freedom becomes conditional. Opposition begins to feel like moral offense. Every democracy that has collapsed from within has seen this transition play out, from law to personality, from citizenship to servitude, masquerading as unity. Trump's Golden Age speech fits cleanly inside that lineage. The phrase Golden Age of America sounds uplifting, even nostalgic, but hidden beneath it is the idea that the leader defines the age, that whatever he declares is true becomes true by proclamation. Once that's accepted, power no longer needs to justify itself. If everything is perfect because he says it is, no one is permitted to measure. There's an even subtler danger that follows, though. When people are told again and again that the story matters more than the reality, they begin to internalize that hierarchy. The leader's words acquire more credibility than their own experiences. A struggling worker hears Trump declare that the economy is booming. His lived pain becomes dissonance. A parent dealing with unsafe streets hears that crime is gone. Doubt begins to feel like betrayal. The leader's story becomes a mirror reflecting not what is, but what he needs people to see. And in that mirror, those who don't fit the reflection are labeled obstacles. If the Golden Age doesn't match your life, you are the problem. That's why the rhetoric matters, because it's not just distraction, it's conditioning. The danger isn't that everyone will believe him. It's that enough people will stop caring whether they believe him or not. Once truth feels optional, power becomes absolute. That's how democracies erode, not through one spectacular burst of tyranny, but through an incremental death by indifference. People grow accustomed to the unreality. They live inside the script. The applause becomes a substitute for legitimacy. Trump's Golden Age performance is a case study in that transformation. It wasn't simply a political speech, but an act of narrative conquest. He erased the Supreme Court defeat, replaced constraint with triumph, and recast his presidency as a miracle of self-generation. Facts became ornaments, arranged to flatter the overseer. Even the applause from lawmakers took on a ritual quality, affirmation by reflex. That's how arbitrary power normalizes itself, through repetition, ceremony, spectacle. But underneath the spectacle are real consequences. Election officials around the country are operating in fear. Federal agents are sifting through old 2020 ballots on fabricated national security pretexts. Surveillance powers are growing with little oversight. The Justice Department, formerly a guardian of neutrality, now acts as a weapon against those deemed disloyal. Every new assertion of control is wrapped in words like integrity and order, terms carefully stripped of their original meaning. Yet it would be wrong to think the public is fully fooled. Polls consistently show that most Americans don't buy the Golden Age fantasy. They see the contradictions, they hear the exaggerations, they recognize the menace. What's less certain is whether they still believe that resistance can work. Trump doesn't need the majority to worship him. He just needs half the country to disengage. He needs fatigue, cynicism, the quiet surrender that comes when people conclude that nothing they can do can change anything. That's why his speeches aren't aimed at persuasion, but at exhaustion. The confusion is the point. The louder he repeats the fantasy, the heavier the fog becomes. Eventually, enough people stop fighting the narrative because fighting feels pointless. This is the challenge for democratic citizens now, to resist the drift toward unreality, to keep their senses intact, because every authoritarian project depends on people surrendering their own perception. It feeds on the idea that facts are negotiable, that all truths are partisan. Once that relativism takes over, citizens lose their bearings. They start to accept power as a substitute for law. Facts are debated, lies are normalized, and before long the difference between governance and performance disappears entirely. The leader takes the stage, declares victory, and the audience claps because clapping feels safer than asking questions. What Trump calls the Golden Age is not a destination. It's camouflage for decay. It's a carefully lit illusion built to disguise the corrosion beneath it. Every time he declares that freedom has been restored, something else quietly slips away. A limit, a check, a safeguard. What remains is a theater of grandeur covering the machinery of control. And yet there's still an antidote, because the one thing no authoritarian can tolerate is mass vigilance. Trump cannot thrive in a culture that pays attention. His power diminishes every time citizens insist on seeing what's actually happening. The job now is to keep that sight alive. It starts with calling things by their right names. Raiding election offices under false pretenses is not oversight, it's intimidation. Expanding surveillance of Americans is not protection, it's intrusion. Declaring independence from law is not strength, it's corruption. Once we stop bending language to his storyline, the spell begins to break. This will come down to participation, to voting relentlessly and in overwhelming numbers. Because the only defense against invented reality is a collective assertion of real ones. Every ballot cast in defiance of a lie chips away at the illusion of inevitability that keeps despots afloat. Trump doesn't fear protests or court rulings as much as he fears turnout. His movement thrives on disengagement. That's why vigilance isn't just moral or symbolic. It's logistical. Democracy's immune system depends on it. He expects even now to remain in power indefinitely. He speaks openly as though he's ordained to rule. But he isn't infinite. No strong man is once enough people decide that obedience is no longer automatic. The polls that show most citizens rejecting the Golden Age narrative are a reminder that the story isn't over. Not yet. But awareness alone won't stop it. Only organized resistance, grounded in law and scale, can do that. Seeing the truth isn't enough. Acting on it is what keeps the republic alive. So the question becomes a personal one for everyone listening. What do you believe more, your own eyes or the script he's selling you? When a president tells you that liberty itself is an obstacle, that criticism is treason, that he alone defines the will of the people. Do you nod along, or do you remember that the whole purpose of the Constitution was to prevent exactly that claim? Democracy doesn't depend on any single office holder. It depends on citizens insisting that power deserves scrutiny. That night in the chamber, Trump stood before the nation and tried to breathe life into his mythology. He looked out and saw the reflection he wanted to project. Lawmakers in suits, images of order, applause timed to the camera. It was pageantry masquerading as proof. If you watch closely, you could almost see the fear driving the performance, the fear that facts, once acknowledged, would shrink him back down to scale. A man who must call every moment a miracle, every setback a conspiracy, every critic a traitor, is not channeling strength. He's confessing weakness. He's terrified that truth still holds more power than his voice. That's why this matters, because beneath all the swagger is insecurity, and beneath insecurity lies opportunity. We can still use it. The antidote to his fantasy isn't violence or revenge, it's exposure, vigilance, consistency, refusing to be talked out of what we know. There's nothing mystical about the Golden Age illusion. It's just fabrication at scale. The minute the public stops applauding, the illusion withers. We can't tolerate much more if our democratic republic is to survive. But that doesn't mean despair. Quite the opposite. Because if citizens open their eyes, speak and act, the myth collapses. His power isn't infinite. It's performative. It depends on the audience playing along. When the applause stops, the performance ends. When people stop mistaking dominance for governance, democracy becomes possible again. The road back to that possibility begins next November. It begins with the choice to see through the fog and trust what we see still matters more than the stories we're told. This has been America's Fractured Politics. Thank you for listening, and please keep the faith. Until next time.